The day was sunny, but the feeling Ellen had in her chest was that of a storm about to form. Everything had changed so quickly. In less than 24 hours, she went from the orphanage to a new home. But that feeling of insecurity didn't go away. No matter how hard she tried, something inside her told her that things wouldn't be as perfect as they seemed. The Martins were a friendly couple. Mrs. Linda, a woman with an easy smile and gentle gestures, welcomed her with open arms as if she had been her daughter for years. Mr. Jack, a man with a firm voice and calm demeanor, seemed the type who would never be shaken, someone who trusted completely in the people around him. And Gale, their son, looked at Ellen with an expression that seemed a mix of curiosity and support. He was 17, older than her, but with something unsettling in his eyes. It was as if he had seen more than anyone his age should. "Ellen, welcome to our home," Linda said with a warm smile, extending a friendly hand, the same hand that had caressed Ellen's hair upon her arrival. "We have everything you need. You'll see how at home you'll feel here." Ellen smiled shyly, her eyes avoiding looking at Gale, who was still watching her silently, as if trying to figure something out about her. She didn't know why, but she felt an odd discomfort in the way he looked at her. A strange feeling she couldn't understand, but it made her skin crawl. The house was beautiful, large, and filled with light. The walls were decorated with family photos, and the air was fresh, with the sweet scent of coffee coming from the kitchen. Everything seemed so perfect, so safe. But inside, Ellen felt like she was adrift, like she was sinking in a sea of uncertainties. Linda and Jack showed her the room, which was bigger than anything she'd ever had in her life. There were toys, books, and even a window overlooking the garden. Everything looked exactly like her dreams. However, even with all the comfort, she couldn't relax. There was something there, in the shadows, that she couldn't touch. She lay down on the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, unable to sleep. The night felt longer than usual, and the silence of the house wrapped around her like a cloak of darkness. When she finally drifted off to sleep, she was woken by a soft noise at the door. Gale was there, standing, looking at her with an expression Ellen couldn't identify. "Are you okay, Ellen?" he asked, his voice low, almost as if he wanted to make sure no one else heard. She nodded, feeling her whole body tense. There was something in his presence that sent chills down her spine. He stood there, watching her, for what Ellen swore was more than 5 minutes. But then, without saying anything else, he moved away, leaving her alone in the darkness. In the following days, Ellen tried to get used to her new life, but something inside her remained on alert. Gale seemed kind at first, but there was something in his gestures, in the words he spoke, in the way he looked at her, that didn't feel right. He would seek her out in the hallways, at times when she thought she'd be alone, and always ask curious questions about her life in the orphanage, about her family, things she didn't want to remember. He seemed to have an unhealthy need to know everything about her, and even though Ellen tried to push him away, he wouldn't give her space. She knew she should tell the parents, but what could she say? There was nothing she could put into words. They seemed so busy with their own lives, with their own problems. Jack, the father, was always in the office, and Linda, though sweet and attentive, seemed oblivious to the growing distance between the family members. It was on a particularly cold night, when Ellen was alone in the living room, that she first realized something very strange was happening with Gale. He appeared at the door, as if he knew she was there. He didn't say anything, but the way he approached her was odd, as if he wanted something more, something she couldn't comprehend. He sat next to her, closer than she would have liked, and looked at her with an unsettling intensity. "You know I'll always be here for you, right, Ellen?" he murmured, his voice soft and calm. But there was something in the way he said it that made Ellen shrink back. Something that made her want to run, but at the same time she didn't know where she would go. He touched her shoulder in what seemed like a friendly gesture, but something inside her reacted with a sense of danger. She didn't know what to do, so she just stayed silent, not looking at him. Ellen began to realize that, contrary to what her parents thought, her life in that house wasn't safe. Something was wrong, and she couldn't understand what it was. She tried to push the thoughts away, but every day Gale's presence seemed to intensify, becoming more suffocating, more invasive. She didn't know what she would do, but the fear she felt seemed bigger than anything she had ever experienced. The Martins' house seemed, from a distance, like the perfect place to live. Ellen's parents were loving and always tried to make sure she felt part of the family. But the more time passed, the more Ellen felt that something didn't fit. She began to realize that Gale's smiles and kind words hid something darker, something she couldn't fully understand, but that made her uncomfortable, restless. Every day Gale seemed to get closer to her. It started with casual conversations, but soon he began to appear at times when Ellen didn't want him there, like when she was reading in her room or trying to sleep. He would always appear out of nowhere with that strange expression, as if he had something more he couldn't say but was dying to tell. "Hey, Ellen, want to go for a walk?" he asked one afternoon, appearing at the door of her room. His tone was soft, but there was a tension behind it, something Ellen couldn't yet identify. She hesitated. She didn't know why, but she preferred to be alone. She wanted to go out with Linda or Jack, but never with Gale. He felt like a shadow she couldn't shake. "No, thanks, Gale. I'm fine here," she replied, feeling the nervousness course through her body. She knew he wouldn't be satisfied, and she was right. Gale, instead of insisting, simply took a step back and looked at her with a cold smile. "All right. If you change your mind, I'll be around." Ellen shuddered. Something about that smile didn't feel right. It wasn't the smile of a brother. It was the smile of someone who knew more than they should know, who was playing a game with no rules. In the following days, Ellen began to feel more and more isolated. Her parents, always so busy, didn't notice the small changes in her behavior. She was becoming more withdrawn, quieter, and the marks of exhaustion on her face weren't just from sleepless nights. She no longer felt safe in the house, and somehow she knew Gale was behind it. His behavior began to change even more. One morning, Ellen was in the kitchen, trying to make breakfast, when she felt a presence behind her. She turned around and found Gale silently watching her. He didn't say anything, but his gaze seemed heavy, loaded with something that made her shiver. "Can I help you with that?" he asked, his tone too casual for the situation. Ellen shook her head, stepping back to the other side of the counter. He didn't move. He stayed there, waiting, as if expecting a reaction from her. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile. I'm fine, really," she said, trying to stay calm. But inside she was panicking. His presence was suffocating, and she didn't know how to shake him off. Gale seemed to be taking every opportunity to infiltrate her life further. He knew how to present himself as the cool brother, the brother who loved her. But Ellen couldn't ignore the signs that were becoming more evident. There was something wrong with his behavior. He was always nearby, always watching, always ready to manipulate the situation. It was one afternoon, when she was alone in the living room, that Gale entered quietly, closing the door behind him. Ellen didn't notice his presence until he was right next to her, so close that she could smell him. "You're afraid of me, aren't you?" Gale asked, almost whispering, his eyes fixed on hers. Ellen felt a lump in her throat. She didn't know how to respond. He was so close, and there was something in the air, a silent pressure that made her feel like she was sinking. But she couldn't tell the truth. She couldn't say yes, because she knew that if she did, he would force her to admit something she didn't fully understand. Gale leaned forward, his gaze locked with hers, as if he were waiting for a reaction. Ellen took a step back, feeling a wave of panic spread through her body. "Can you leave me alone, Gale?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just stood there, watching her, with a crooked smile on his face. The silence between them was heavy, and Ellen could hear her own heart pounding in her chest. The feeling of being in danger grew with each passing second. Finally, Gale stepped back, but not before giving her one last threatening look. "I just wanted to know if you were okay," he said in a voice too calm to be sincere. Ellen stood there, alone, feeling a growing coldness in her chest. She was beginning to understand what was happening. Gale was trying to control everything, manipulate everything, and no one seemed to notice. Her parents, despite being so kind, were blind to what was happening right under their noses. She began to wonder if she would ever have the courage to tell them, if she would ever be able to leave that house, which seemed more and more like a prison. But for now, she had to endure. She had to survive, and above all, she had to find a way to escape Gale's grasp. Ellen spent the next few days in a constant state of alert. It wasn't just Gale's presence that bothered her anymore, but the way he seemed to control the environment around her, as if he were always monitoring her steps, her glances, her words. She began to feel like she was being watched with every move, every breath, and it made her more tense, more nervous. She tried to distract herself, focusing on her daily tasks, like tidying up her room or doing homework. But the discomfort was inescapable. Gale was always there, invisible and present, waiting for the right moment to approach. He began asking questions that seemed trivial at first, but when Ellen analyzed them later, she felt there was something behind them, something hidden in Gale's gaze. He wanted to know what she was thinking, what she was feeling, and if somehow he could manipulate her into falling into his grasp. At school, Ellen tried to concentrate on her classes, but Gale's gaze was always on her mind. He hadn't done anything physically aggressive yet, but the words, the gestures, the tone of voice, everything seemed to point to something dark. And it was exactly that day, when the phone rang and she found herself alone with Gale, that the situation escalated to a new level. She was in the living room, finishing her homework, when he entered, his eyes fixed on her. The way he looked at her, without saying anything, made the air around them thick and warm. She felt the need to step away, but she couldn't. He was blocking the only exit. "Ellen," Gale said, his tone light, but there was tension behind it. He seemed to control every word that came out of his mouth. "I saw you in your room last night. You looked uncomfortable. Is everything okay with you?" She didn't know how to respond. Anything she said would sound suspicious, as if she were trying to hide something. She felt panic rising in her chest, a wave of fear flooding her veins. For a moment she thought about lying, saying she was fine, but then a feeling of desperation overtook her body. I'm not feeling very well," she finally answered, her voice faltering. She didn't know what else to say, but Gale's expression changed immediately. There was no compassion or empathy in his face. He just watched her, like a predator, waiting for the right moment to act. "I understand," he said slowly, moving closer to her. "You know you can trust me, right? I'm your brother, Ellen. I just want you to be okay." The way he said it, with a soft yet authoritative tone, made Ellen's blood run cold. Something inside her knew this wasn't right. What did he want from her? Why was he so fixated on her? Gale took a step forward, and Ellen instinctively took a step back. The pressure was unbearable, and she felt a wave of claustrophobia. No matter how much she tried to control herself, fear dominated her. He was there with that look that made her feel as if she were sinking into an endless abyss. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his eyes piercing hers. "But you don't have to be afraid of me, Ellen. I just want to help. I just want you to feel safe here, with me." She couldn't take it anymore. Something inside her exploded in a mix of panic and anger. Without saying anything more, she grabbed her backpack and ran to her room, locking the door behind her. Her heart was racing, and she threw herself on the bed, breathing deeply, trying to control the feeling that she was about to collapse. She knew Gale was just one door away, but at the same time, it felt like he was in another world, a world she couldn't escape from. What was happening to her? Why was she having these intense reactions? Ellen wasn't sure, but she felt like she was in a constant battle against something she couldn't see, but that she felt in every fiber of her being. And the worst part was, no one seemed to notice. Her parents were so absorbed in the idea that the family was perfect that they couldn't see what was happening right before their eyes. At night, when the house finally fell silent, Ellen tried to sleep, but the images of Gale's gaze and the feeling of suffocation never let her be at peace. She tossed and turned in bed, trying to find a way to escape, but always came to the same conclusion. She couldn't tell anyone. She couldn't tell her parents. They wouldn't believe her. Or worse, she feared they would accuse her of making everything up. In the days that followed, Gale continued his constant presence. He always tried to start conversations, approached her at inconvenient moments, and made comments that made her uneasy. And every time he did that, she felt herself sinking deeper into a web she couldn't escape from. Ellen didn't know how much longer she could endure this. The feeling of being watched, of being controlled, was beginning to consume her mind. She knew something had to change, but she didn't know how to act. She didn't know how to make others see the truth. With each passing moment, the Martins' house stopped being a safe and welcoming home. It was becoming a silent battlefield where fear and uncertainty reigned. And the worst part was that Ellen was alone, fighting against an enemy no one else could see. Ellen's life had become a silent battlefield. where every breath seemed to carry the weight of a secret too heavy to share. The Martins' house, which once seemed like the perfect refuge, was now a place of constant tension. She no longer knew who to trust. Every passing day, Gale's behavior became more unbearable. He was turning into a shadow, always present, but at the same time invisible to others. He knew what she thought, what she felt, and used that to his advantage. Everything started to worsen when Gale began acting, even more manipulatively, as if weaving a web around her. Ellen realized that the more she tried to push him away, the closer he got. Every word he spoke was carefully planned to destabilize her, and she no longer knew if what she felt was real or if he had somehow poisoned her thoughts. He always said what she wanted to hear, but his gaze, that gaze, seemed to say something more. It was during a weekend, when her parents went out shopping, that the situation reached its breaking point. Gale entered Ellen's room without knocking, as if he had permission to be there. She was sitting on the bed, staring out the window, trying to forget what was happening in her life. She didn't want to think about Gale anymore, but she couldn't help it. He chased her even in her thoughts. "You're distant, Ellen," he said, closing the door behind him with a smile on his face. "You're not talking to me anymore." "Are you ignoring me?" She tried not to look at him, but the feeling that he was closer than he should be made her body tense. She wanted to scream, wanted to run away, but she felt paralyzed. He was playing with her mind, and Ellen no longer knew how to react. "I'm not ignoring you," she said, her voice shaky. I'm just trying to understand all of this." Gale took a step closer to the bed, and Ellen's fear intensified. She didn't want him to get closer, didn't want to be there, in that room, with him, but she didn't know what to do. He knew that. He knew she was trapped, with no way out. "Understand what?" Gale asked, now standing beside her. "You don't need to understand, Ellen. You just need to trust me. I'm your brother, and I just want to help you. Let me help you." Those words, said with such softness, sounded like a veiled threat. Ellen felt a chill run down her spine. He watched her with an intense, penetrating gaze, as if waiting for something. A movement, a gesture, any response. But Ellen couldn't stay quiet any longer. She couldn't bear the silence, the weight of the guilt and shame she felt. She wanted to scream, to tell the truth, but she didn't know how. Fear paralyzed her. Gale then touched her shoulder, and Ellen flinched, quickly pulling away. Her eyes widened, and she felt her breath falter. He looked at her with a surprised expression, but quickly recovered. Taking a step back, "It's okay, Ellen," he said with a weak smile. "I just want you to know that you will always be safe with me. I just want to protect you." But the protection Gale offered was anything but comforting. It was possessive, suffocating, and Ellen knew that now. He wasn't protecting her. He was trying to dominate her, possess her, and she felt it in every fiber of her being. She looked at him, trying to find an escape, trying to understand how she could flee from this situation that felt inescapable. The silence dragged on for a few seconds before Gale finally stepped away, leaving Ellen alone again. She felt the pressure on her chest ease a little, but there was still the fear, the doubt, the certainty that she wasn't safe there anymore. But she didn't know where to go, didn't know what to do. Her parents were becoming more and more oblivious, and the idea of telling them what was happening seemed impossible. How could she believe that the Martins, so welcoming and loving, would allow something so terrible to happen under their roof? The next morning, Ellen woke up with a heavy weight on her chest. The day had barely started, and it already felt as suffocating as the previous night. She tried to keep her composure, to seem normal to others, but she felt like she was on the verge of a breakdown. Things were spiraling out of control. She was being crushed by something she couldn't understand, and with every passing moment, the weight of the guilt, fear, and shame grew heavier. She didn't know how to deal with it, how to tell the truth. Gale's behavior was becoming more erratic, and Ellen felt like he was forcing her to play a game she didn't want to play. But deep down she knew he wouldn't stop. He would continue, and she would have to find a way to stop him before it was too late. While the Martins' house continued with its facade of normality, Ellen knew that somewhere behind the walls the truth was about to come to light. But until then, she would need to survive, deal with the monster Gale had become, and try to keep her sanity intact. Every day that passed, the lie was becoming harder to hide, and the truth was beginning to weave itself into the threads of a web that Ellen didn't know how to escape from. The days seemed longer and longer for Ellen. The house, once a symbol of hope, now felt like an invisible cage tight and suffocating. She was on the verge of losing control. Gale's behavior kept intensifying, and her attempts to deal with it were becoming more desperate. She knew something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't find a way to express what she was feeling, to ask for help. That morning she woke up with a heavy body, as if the weight of the previous night was still in her bones. When she looked to the side, she saw Gale sitting on the edge of her bed, watching her. She swallowed hard, her eyes wide, her heart racing. How had he gotten in without her noticing? He seemed so calm, so in control, as if he was waiting for some reaction from her. "Good morning, Ellen," he said, his voice soft, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Are you okay?" Ellen didn't answer. She just looked at him, with her chest tight. How could he ask that? How could he look at her with those calm eyes, knowing what he was doing? Gale noticed the silence and smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile. He got up from the bed, walking to the window, as if nothing had happened. "You know, Ellen," he began, "the parents are starting to notice. They've noticed you're not the same anymore. Do you know what that means?" Ellen swallowed hard, trying to process what he had said. No, it couldn't be. They were starting to notice? Her parents were starting to see? Or was it just another one of his manipulations? But when she looked up to meet his eyes, she saw something in his face, something she hadn't noticed before. It was a strange smile, a smile of triumph, as if he knew exactly what was going on and how everything would end. That expression made her freeze inside. He was in control, and she didn't know how to escape. "You don't need to worry, Ellen," Gale said in a calm tone. "I'm your brother. I'll always be here for you. And our parents, they'll understand in time. I know how to make this work." She got out of bed, her mind a mess, her body trembling. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to do something, had to get out of that house, out of that situation, before it was too late. It was then, on that afternoon, that everything changed. Ellen finally decided to tell the truth. She knew she could no longer live with it. She knew that if she didn't speak now, she might never get the chance again. The fear, shame, and pain she felt inside were unbearable. The internal struggle between speaking or staying silent raged within her, but she had made her decision. She needed to be heard. She walked to the living room where her parents were talking. Gale's face was in her mind, and his words echoed in her head. She was about to take the most important step of her life. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling but determined. Her parents looked at her, somewhat surprised but curious. They had always encouraged her to talk about her feelings, but they never imagined what she was about to say. Ellen looked at them both, her eyes filled with fear, but also with a desperate need to be understood. She had to be heard. She needed to tell the truth. "Gale, he's hurting me," she began, her voice faltering. "He is doing things that scare me. I don't know how to say this, but I can't stay silent anymore. He's hurting me." The room fell into absolute silence. Her parents' eyes were fixed on her, but there was no understanding, only confusion. Their reaction wasn't what Ellen had expected. They looked at her as if they didn't know how to handle what she was saying. "Ellen, dear, you're saying things that don't make sense," her mother said with a concerned yet disbelieving expression. "Gale is a good boy. He would never do something like that. He loves you like a sister." Ellen felt her hope crumble. There was no doubt in their eyes, no room for questioning the truth. But her mother's words were like knives cutting through what was left of her courage. I'm not making this up, Mom. He's hurting me. I need you to believe me, please." But the words fell into the void. The silence was filled with a sense of denial, as if everything she had said was a nightmare no one wanted to believe. She looked at her parents but saw no support, just distrust. They were protecting Gale, not her. That night, Ellen couldn't sleep. She was devastated, empty. She knew she had done the right thing, but their reaction had been so cold and distant that she felt a pain worse than anything Gale could do. The truth seemed to be swallowed by the lie, and she was alone. But what she didn't know was that Gale's lie was beginning to unravel. The truth was finally coming to light, and it would be impossible for anyone to ignore it much longer. The next morning was different. Ellen woke up, but there was no lightness to the morning like there used to be. She felt that something was about to happen, something she couldn't predict. The feeling of oppression was in every corner of the house, and she knew that the fight for the truth was just beginning. But at the same time, something inside her started to strengthen. The courage she thought she had lost was coming back, little by little. She descended the stairs, her eyes fixed on the floor, but her heart pounding irregularly. Her parents were in the kitchen, but they were silent, as if still trying to process what she had said the night before. The tension in the air was palpable. Gale wasn't there. Something about his behavior that morning seemed different. He didn't show up for breakfast, as he did every day. His silence was almost deafening, and Ellen couldn't take her eyes off every corner of the house, trying to find some clue, some evidence that would confirm what she knew in her heart. "Ellen," her mother said, breaking the silence, "I know you're going through something difficult. But Gale is your brother. He would never do anything to hurt you. Let's give this time to calm down." She wanted to scream, wanted to shatter the glass of the lie being built around her. But instead she just nodded. She knew the words wouldn't make a difference at that moment. Her parents were blind, not because they wanted to be, but because the pain of facing reality was too much for them. I just want you to believe me, Ellen said, her voice fragile but full of conviction. I'm not going to lie about this. But before anything more could be said, the front door opened and Gale walked in. He seemed calm, calmer than ever. There was no longer the soft smile she used to see on his face. He seemed distant, almost grim. I heard what you said, Gale said, his voice cold and controlled. You accuse me of terrible things, Ellen, things that don't make sense. I just wanted us to be a happy family. Ellen looked at him, feeling her heart tighten in her chest. He was trying once again to manipulate the situation, placing the blame on her. But she wasn't going to allow him to control her life anymore, to make her feel like she was the one in the wrong. I'm not staying silent anymore, she replied firmly. I'm going to make you pay for what you did. Gale took a step toward her, but this time Ellen didn't back down. He could try whatever he wanted, but she was ready to face the truth. Ellen, do you really think anyone will believe you? Gale said, laughing coldly. Do you think your parents, who have always loved me, will listen to you? I'm the perfect son to them. You're nothing but a troubled girl trying to ruin our lives. She felt the weight of his words, but at the same time she knew he was lying. Gale's lie was crumbling before her, and she knew the truth could no longer be ignored. And that's when something unexpected happened. The door of the house opened again, but it wasn't Gale who entered. It was the police. Ellen looked at the door, confused and surprised, but her eyes lit up with a spark of hope she hadn't expected to see. The police quickly entered, and everything started to make sense. Someone had made the report. Gale looked at the police with wide eyes, but said nothing. He knew he was finished. You can't do this, Gale shouted, beginning to approach Ellen, but the police stopped him immediately. One of them grabbed him by the arms and pulled him away from her. Gale Martins, you are under arrest for abuse. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court, the officer said authoritatively, and Ellen couldn't help but feel a deep, almost suffocating relief upon hearing those words. The truth had finally come to light. Ellen looked at her parents, who were in shock, but at the same time, she knew that although it was late, they would finally start to see who Gale really was. The man she thought was her brother, the one she wanted to love, had revealed himself to be her worst nightmare. The story she had kept hidden for so long, the horrors she had lived through in silence, were now being exposed to the world. As the police took Gale away, Ellen felt a mix of emotions. Fear, sadness, anger, but also a sense of liberation. Finally, she was free. The following days were difficult, and recovery wouldn't be easy. But Ellen knew that, at least now, she was in control. The lie had been broken. She was no longer alone. That night she lay in bed, gazing out of the window. The sky was clear, cloudless, and the moon shone like a distant beacon. She took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She knew her life would never be the same, but now she had a chance to start over. And that night, she finally managed to sleep in peace.